Hello, good morning, and good evening, wherever you are. This is April from University of Southern California. Welcome audience in Zoom, as well as our followers at the live streaming platforms of USC Graduate Education. This is the 126th USC event, which are series webinars devoting to spread cutting-edge ideas and knowledge in different academia and industries. Today's topic is current issues in language acquisition, the social foundations of language education. We are so glad to have two keynote speakers, Dr. Katarina Moore and Dr. Jennifer Crawford from USC Rossier School of Education. Dr. Moore is Associate Professor of Clinical Education, and Dr. Crawford is Professor of Clinical Education. Welcome, Dr. Crawford and Dr. Moore. And we also have our moderator, Dr. Rob Feuerbach, the Professor of Clinical Education and Chair of MAT TESOL Program. Welcome, Dr. Feuerbach. And from Zoom audience, please mute yourself to ensure event quality. In the last 10 to 15 minutes today's event, we are open to questions, and you can type comments and write your questions in the chat box, and also for the live streaming audience. And this webinar will be recorded and might be used as video material in future. And let's start our journey to learn social foundations of an language education. And now I will pass it over to Dr. Feuerbach.
Great. Thank you so much, April. Welcome, everyone. So glad you're here. I know that there's some of us here in Zoom and then a whole bunch of people out there streaming through other venues. So it's great to have you with us. I wish we could see faces. I'm sure we'd recognize a few faces. And then, of course, a whole bunch of you that we're so glad you're here as well. So it's a real pleasure to add a few additional words of introduction for our speakers today. Just a couple of words that I'd like to say before I pass the floor over to Drs. Moore and Crawford. Dr. Moore, the work that they're going to be presenting tonight, based on their most recent book, draws directly from their experience, from their own research. Dr. Moore focuses her research on aspects of language learning, the social aspects of language learning and teaching. To do that, she uses discourse analysis, ethnographic methods to explore how classroom practices can promote linguistic and cultural expertise, and how we can, as teachers, co-construct social worlds with our students to create a more equitable and inclusive classroom environment. And so you're going to be hearing how her work directly underpins what she'll be sharing tonight. Dr. Crawford's research agenda centers as well on issues of race and social justice and language education. Basically, her work recognizes that teachers and families in language education often face linguistic, racial, socioeconomic inequities that go back to longstanding legacies of cultural power and language domination. And these can have negative impacts, especially on our most vulnerable students and families. So I'm so excited to have them here tonight and to know that they will be sharing their work with you. In addition to their really impressive research records, which we just heard about, I also just want to say they are world-class teachers, world-class practitioners. It's such a pleasure to have them here. We are close colleagues. We work together very closely. They lead multiple courses in our TESOL program and other programs in the school. They're involved in curriculum design and program design and advising and mentoring students at the master's and doctoral levels. So the ideas that they're going to be sharing with you tonight, it's not head knowledge. This is also heart knowledge. It's firsthand knowledge. It draws right on their own experience. And I know that you're going to learn a lot from them tonight. So the book they're drawing on tonight, Introduction to Social Foundations in Language Education, draws directly on their work in our program. I also know that this book is going to be a great positive feedback loop, and it's going to help strengthen our program and give our students an amazing learning experience. So I'm so happy they're here. Drs. Moore, Dr. Crawford, thank you for giving generously of your time to be here tonight. And with that, I think I'll turn the floor over to both of you.
Thank you so much. It's so good to be here. Thank you all. It's a pleasure. Thank you, Dr. Philback. Thank you, April. Very happy to be here. So we'd like to talk to you a little bit today about our, like you said, new work on social foundations of language education. This is a cover of our book. And we really, when we started working on this book, we were both teaching classes in our MAT TESOL program. And we felt like our students really needed to have a little bit more scaffolding, a little bit more support in understanding of the different things that they read about from empirical studies, from empirical research, meaning firsthand research that is done on language education. And we tried very hard to figure out how can we help our learners do that? How can we help our students in our classrooms to become better teachers, to become better language teachers who are focused on issues of equity, who are focused on really their learners who are, whose heart is in the right place and whose mind is in the right place and who have the right ability to go into the classrooms and become pioneers in this really important field of language education. And so we came up with this book and we tested it on a group of students last year successfully and incorporated their feedback that they provided to us. And that feedback is going to come into this first edition. So what we would like to do today is we would like to really talk to you about some important concepts in the social aspects of language education. We hear quite a lot about how one's minds and cognitive processes are so important for language learning. We hear a lot about them. Psycholinguistic aspects of language learning, which are really, really important and that are really, crucial for understanding learning. In this particular book, we are focusing on social aspects of language learning. And it is the social aspects that are going to really help our practitioners in understanding of how lives outside of the school are consequential for language learning, how experiences outside of the school, be those racialized experiences or gendered experiences, are going to be really important in the journeys that your language learners will take as they are engaging in the transformations, as they're engaging in language learning and getting to be, full members of the communities that they would like to participate in. And so we will today we will take you, Jen, can you move on one slide, through some important aspects, 5 highlighted here. So the first aspect is getting to know your students. We'll shortly talk about how important it is to get to know your students. Identity, socialization, and inclusion as being important social aspects of language learning. Proficiencies at and practices at home and school viewed from social lens. And ideologies, programs, and policies. And finally, we'll end with the important topic of theory-informed and method-driven pedagogies in TESOL. So thank you all. And I think, Dr. Crawford, I'm going to give you the floor here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moore and Dr. Philback. It's a pleasure to not only respect and admire your colleagues, but also to be to have the space, to hold the space with them to grow intellectually and in our own practices. And that's something I've been able to count as a fortunate aspect of my profession and of our program for over a decade now. So it's exciting that we get to share this work with you, which, as Dr. Moore mentioned, and as Dr. Philback mentioned, is greatly informed by so many of our students in our MAT TESOL program, both as they come in and engage these ideas with us in the program, as well as we see them as we stay connected once they're in the field, teaching, continuing to teach or conduct research. So the first thing I'd like to share with you all is about getting to know your students. This is an essential first step. in this aspect of getting to know your students, we're emphasizing the significance of understanding your students' diverse backgrounds, experiences, and knowledge as English language teachers. Some of the key takeaways here is that all language learners bring a range of sociocultural, academic, professional, and linguistic background knowledge and experience into the classroom, into the language learning classroom, and bring that to bear on their language learning experiences. Secondly, language teachers should get to know their diverse learners' knowledge and experiences. One way for us to do this is through conversation and observation in the classroom. Educators should really aim to challenge their own assumptions about learners' knowledge by engaging in dialogue and conversation with their students. And finally, language teachers should leverage learners' experiences to ensure equitable and inclusive instruction in classroom culture. Teachers should think through the ways that English language teaching, curriculum, and instruction can center and privilege minoritized students and minoritized communities' knowledge and experiences. And hopefully this could resonate with all of you as as folks who are developing multiple languages and multilingual learners. We bring our unique set of knowledge and experiences in and outside of the class to maximize and accelerate our own language learning. So today I invite you to a journey back to California in the 1940s, to the story of Sylvia Mendez, a young girl who stood at the crossroads of educational segregation in California. Throughout our book and throughout our class, we'll be coming back to historical moments, as well as lived experiences in the classroom and in the community. So I'm going to bring some insight from the state of California. We will bring some historical examples to highlight some of what we're talking about. So when Sylvia Mendez, featured here, was 8 years old, her aunt went to enroll her brothers and her lighter-skinned cousins into their new neighborhood school. This was the 17th Street Elementary School, not too far away from USC here in Southern California. School officials would enroll Sylvia's cousins with French-sounding last names, but not her darker-skinned brothers with Mexican-sounding last names. This was a Mexican-American family. The decision to not accept the Mendez children was based solely on the color of their skin and their last names. Sylvia and her family's fight against a school system that judged her by her surname and skin color paved the way for desegregation. In fact, at this time in Southern California in the 1940s, Asian American and Latino American students were those students who were segregated and not allowed to attend white schools. When the Supreme Court case Mendez versus Westminster School District was decided in 1946, California Supreme Court case was decided in 1946 in California, and it became California actually became the first state in the country to desegregate its schools and other public spaces. This story is often not told, as we hear about the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education case that desegregated schools nationally. This actually happened thanks to Asian American and Mexican American families working together, Chinese American and Mexican American and Japanese American families working together to challenge this segregation. So as we gather here in this space of the webinar, I'd like us to think about and carry forward this legacy, ensuring that our teaching bridges not just the linguistic gaps, but also some of the cultural and social divides that we often encounter in our classroom. In our pursuit of equity, we must first understand the cultural capital each student brings to the language learning process. This is the sum of their knowledge and skills and cultural prowess, often inherited through their family's journey. Picture a student who helps their parents navigate English in a new country, or another who translates during family gatherings. These experiences are their capital or their strength that they bring to the classroom and to the language learning process. Likewise, funds of knowledge refers to the reservoirs of cultural wisdom and practices within students and language learners' communities. Again, imagine a student's familiarity with traditional herbal remedies, or another's expertise in a family business. This knowledge is a resource waiting to be tapped into and celebrated within our educational frameworks and practices in English language teaching. Linguistic capital, another related concept that we discuss in our book, then is not just the ability to communicate, but it's a power, power it confers within social interactions. It's the student who switches between dialects or languages with ease, showcasing a rich linguistic identity. And those skills can be brought to bear and leveraged within the English language learning classroom. As educators, our methods should be akin to critical ethnography, where we become active participants in the cultural narrative of our classrooms, understanding the dynamics and diversities of our students' lives. Think of it as being a cultural detective, where each clue uncovers more about the student's background, aiding in tailored, inclusive, and individualized responses in our teaching that accelerates and challenges our language learners to achieve to their highest potential. Ratiolinguistic frameworks challenges us to look beyond language as just a mere tool for communication or a system of signs, and to see it as a cultural artifact interwoven with students' racial identity, national identity, and multiple social experiences. We must challenge and be cautious not to equate proficiency in English with intelligence or student worth, but recognize and bring all of our students' skills and experiences to bear in the language learning process. To create an environment that truly reflects the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also is the most effective classroom language learning experience, we must first observe using tools like I'm featuring here on the slide, like the culturally responsive instructional observation protocol. Here you'll see that we've selected several elements from the culturally responsive instructional observation protocol, including things like classroom relationships, family collaboration, that's the collaboration with the learners' families, various assessment practices, instructional practices, discourse or communication within the language classroom, as well as critical consciousness or critical thinking, and using the language to apply outside of the classroom. These are examples of what that could look like, leveraging these students' knowledge and experiences, what that could look like in our own language teaching practices. While time today doesn't permit me to go into great detail about every single example, I want to highlight that it prompts us to reflect on our teaching practices and foster a space where students' cultures and experiences are not just included, but are integral to the curriculum. In practice, this means we review prior lessons and introduce new concepts. We must weave in the students' background knowledge and experiences. For instance, we might employ something like a think, pair, share activity with prompts rooted in students' cultural context or experiences that can foster deeper connections and understanding. Seeing language not just as a system of signs, but as a form of meaningful communication that can bridge cultural divides and differences. A powerful example of bringing this to life using a KWL chart we can use that kind of traditional chart and include and expand that to ask questions like, and include which actions can be taken based on a new knowledge we're gaining from in the language classroom. Students can even reflect on how their cultural understanding influences their learning and how they can apply this knowledge to affect change within their local communities, workplaces, or families. We can also do things like a double entry journal where we can encourage students to chart new vocabulary or new concept keywords from a text that they are reading, and then write their reflections and reactions on that text. So in closing on this first topic of identifying and leveraging background knowledge, I want to affirm that our teaching should not merely be a transmission of knowledge, but a dialogue, a celebration of the rich tapestry of experiences each student brings to our classroom. Like Sylvia Mendez's victory, I would hope and aspire to work with all of you so that our efforts lead to a brighter, more inclusive and effective language learning experience and communities in the future. with that, I want to turn it over to Dr. Moore.
Thank you so much, Dr. Crawford. So the mentioning of communities, I think, is so important because community sources are sources of tremendous wealth of information, and that could really be important for language learners that we have in our classroom. We wanted to share with you today and with all of our students an example of when communities can come together in an effort to revitalize a language that was lost. So as many of you may know, Hawaii has not always been part of the United States. In the year 1800, there were 800,000 speakers of the Hawaiian language. In 1898, the United States annexed Hawaii as a territory and banned Hawaiian language in schools and governmental institutions. And as a result, in the 1960s, we saw fewer than 2,000 speakers of Hawaiian. So the numbers went from being 800,000 to 2,000 in 1960s. And that the community of Hawaiians felt that they needed to do something about that, really their situation, and started revitalization movement in the 1960s. And that led in 2020 to approximately 27,000 speakers of the Hawaiian language. When interviewed for the PBS documentary, one of the teachers in Hawaiian immersion school said that when your identity is stripped away, your language is taken away, your culture is bad, and you emerge as a hollow core of nothingness. But when what revitalization does, it is about knowing who you are as a Kanaka Hawaiian, so we can define our future. So many Hawaiians who supported the Hawaiian language revitalization efforts, they share the importance of Hawaiian language to their sense of belonging to their homeland, the importance of speaking the language to elders and teaching Hawaiian to their children, in addition to language. And really their commitment to support their community as a thriving bilingual rather than monolingual English community. And so in the picture that we see here, we see a picture of a classroom where the interconnectedness of language and culture is visible in one elementary education classroom. So the teacher is playing ukulele, and we see the images of language behind her that is presented in the Hawaiian language in a very contextualized manner. The children here are exposed to images of everyday life, family, community, and their local traditions and history. And through such presentation of language, children are socialized into Hawaiian identity and local understandings. And their communities, their community members, their elders, and their traditions become this really important part of learning language as they're being socialized to become members of that community that is bilingual. Dr. Crawford, can we move to the next slide, please? So from what this example demonstrates is how important the concepts of identity, language socialization, and investment in language learning is important. The community, the state, went from having 2,000 speakers to 27,000 speakers through investment in the language learning, through communities coming together. Their identity, or how do we understand identity? Identity is a material or social sense of belonging to a group. It's dynamic. It considers cultures. It is also social, and it emerges in interaction. The identity of being not just speakers of English, which is the dominant language in the state of Hawaii today, but also the identity of being a Hawaiian and a Hawaiian speaker became a driving force for this community to be able to put those efforts in to revitalization efforts and become successful at that. We actually call those efforts a success today because there are many thriving programs for Hawaiian language in the state of Hawaii. And the concept of language socialization basically is the idea that language is the medium for identity formation. It is through the learning of the Hawaiian language that these individuals in this group learn to become speakers of Hawaiian and learn to become Hawaiian as well as becoming speakers of English and English-speaking residents of the United States. And so one factor that is super important is this idea of investing in that, right? So very often we hear teachers say that, oh, my learners are not motivated. And once somebody is labeled as unmotivated, that can become very dangerous. And investment is a concept that is a little bit different than the concept of motivation, because investment allows us to ask a question as to what are we invested in the practices of the communities that we participate in? These communities practices something that I can align with. Some communities, for example, learners can be very, very motivated to learn the language, but the communities, the classroom communities that they participate in could be racist, or they could be homophobic. They could be, sexist in a way that learners don't want to participate in those communities. They don't want to become part of it. And so thinking of investing in language learning as opposed to just being motivated to learn a language is a very important social aspect of learning, very important social aspect, looking at motivation from the social perspective. So what can we do as teachers in thinking about concepts of identity, concepts of socialization, concepts of inclusion, concepts of investment in our classroom communities? Dr. Crawford, can we go to the next page, please? So as Dr. Crawford was talking about, getting to know our students is super important. And I'm going to add here that learning about the students' identities is very, very important. So now being very specific about what do we learn about that, we can add to the wonderful chart that she had, thinking about the student identities and the spaces that our students occupy, so to say, and their membership in the communities. So through interviewing our students, through talking to our students, we can learn about their identities. We can learn about who they are. We can also create an inclusive classroom culture where all of those identities are welcomed as opposed to being marginalized. And so those identities can become central in how we think about our classroom practices and how we think about our classroom practices as being inclusive. Thinking about creating specific classroom norms, not just the way that we as teachers prefer to have based on our own identities, but thinking about it together with our students, thinking about what are the classroom norms that we can co-create together and then follow those classroom norms so that everybody feels included in our classrooms. That's a really important step in validating one's identity and also validating one's identity and membership in where they imagine them to be as speakers of the language that they are learning. And here on this picture, Hawaiian language as an example for English language learners in an ESL or an ELD classroom. We can also create and participate in the practice of identity exploration, such as name stories. So name stories, everybody probably knows this traditional ways of learning something about your students as in, everybody tells their name and tells them where you're from, etc. Well, we can build on that, and we can ask our students to write their name stories. We can ask them a question: what is in a name? What's in your name? What are what some family ancestry traditions or affiliations are reflected in your name? Have you changed your name? What was your name before your current name? And what is it? What was the choice of changing that name, and what happens in that name? So students can participate in an exercise of writing their name stories, and then they can share their name stories with their classmates so that they can learn more about each other. So identity stereotypes is another activity that we can participate in. Participate in through identity mapping. So in the identity mapping exercise, the first step is that we map the key aspects of our identities. We can have a shape of a tree, for example, we can write it down, or we can have a web, and then we can have our students share stories of when they felt particularly proud of their identity, and then maybe share a time when it was painful to be associated with an aspect of identity, a specific aspect of identity. And then participants can share stereotypes associated with the aspect of their identity that does not describe them accurately. And we can provide them with a frame. I am, but I am not, and they can fill that out. And finally, we can, finish this activity as a whole group, sharing the stories that people participated and challenging the stereotypes that exist around specific identities. In this way, we are really participating in creating a classroom that is not just inclusive and welcoming for everybody, but we are also participating in efforts against stereotyping, efforts against putting people in an identity that may not be in the wider society seen as something that is as positive, and reversing that, and therefore becoming advocates for our students in our own classrooms. So
and just to add to that, something that I've learned from Dr. Moore and Dr. Philback, and learned a great deal in thinking about and reading more of Dr. Moore's research, really resonated with my own language learning experiences. And I'm curious if maybe it's resonated with some of yours, that when we're learning a language, as I had shared, we're not just learning science and systems, we're learning cultural and social practices. And one of the things that's, I think, deeply personal about some of the research that Dr. Moore is bringing is that we're also learning to do a meaningful version of ourselves in the target language. And as language teachers, we should support that journey for students. Because if we reflect on our own language learning experiences, when we've found meaningful ways to do a version of ourselves in the target language, that's when our own learner autonomy, our own intrinsic motivation, our own investment in continuing our language studies, in dedicating more time and effort in those studies, that can tend to increase because we see it as a meaningful part of who we are. So it's really important, again, that we don't just explain grammar and vocabulary. Of course, that's vitally important, but also that we give students opportunities to explore and find a meaningful version of themselves, or to build and contribute to a meaningful version of themselves in the target language, and navigate if they find areas or experience blocks to finding a meaningful version of themselves, whether that's because of cultural conflicts, discrimination, or even maybe inauthentic activities, or a classroom that's not full of joy, as well as effective learning. Turn it back over to Dr. Moore. Thank you for teaching that to me, Dr. Moore.
Thank you for adding that. That was a really, really meaningful idea. So really thinking about being inspirations for our students as well during the process of language learning. So so when we think about language learning, we have to think about this big word proficiency, right? It's to thinking about where we are today, where we want to be tomorrow, what level what is our level of knowledge in a specific language. So thinking of proficiency is super important. And as history shows, that the way that language proficiency can become meaningful in the way that a person is included or excluded from specific life situations. 1970s, I'm going to take you back to 1970s. In 1974, a group of students of Chinese ancestry won a U.S. Supreme Court case against the president of San Francisco Unified School District, Mr. Nichols. So in the 1970s, California decided to integrate its schools. And so San Francisco Unified School Districts absorbed nearly 3,000 students, more like 2,900 students of Chinese ancestry who did not speak English. Out of those students, 2,900 students, only about 1,000 got any help to learn English. So students and their parents, they teamed up with a lawyer and filed a suit against the school district for violating their rights under the 14th Amendment, which promises equal opportunities for all students. So the lower court did not really see it that way. And so they argued that the school district had a fair policy and treated all of the students the same without intentional discrimination. So the court then, so the students and the families decided to take it up to the Supreme Court, which took a different view on this. So the Supreme Court saw that lacking English skills was actually denying the students a real shot at education. And so basically what that meant is that the federal government now had to step up and provide language assistance to English learners. And so as a result of this lawsuit, the Civil Rights Act was extended to include language as discrimination based on language ability, being discrimination based on national origin, and therefore violating the Civil Rights Act. In this picture here, we see students who are in the center of this historical event. And what we see here is we see the writing, interesting writing in the background, that we see it in not just in English, but also in Chinese. I don't know, I don't speak Chinese or read Chinese, but I believe this is Mandarin Chinese based on what I have read about this historical photo. So in this event, when we think about that, somebody's proficiency in the language was a reason for why they were not able to get educational opportunities in this country. And so even though it was back in the 1970s, up to today, one's language proficiency can become a reason why a person can be discriminated against in education and other spheres of life, such as housing and employment, etc. But how do we understand proficiency? Dr. Crawford, can we move to the next slide, please? How should we think about proficiency? So proficiency is a big deal, right? We can get discriminated against based on that proficiency, but what is proficiency? So proficiency can be thought of in terms of the contextual dimension. Language is not used in a vacuum. Language is something that we use in context. So we can think of the contextual use of language as being one area of proficiency that we have to consider. And with that, the idea of communicative competence. In other words, using the specific areas of language or skills, for example, grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, using it in a way that is contextual on the one hand, and within that context to be able to communicate in a way that is appropriate for a particular setting. In other words, communicative competence. That's an important aspect of language proficiency. Another important aspect of language proficiency is the discrete skills. These are psycholinguistic dimensions, right? Discrete language skills, such as grammar, pronunciation, vocabulary, etc., as well as conversational fluency. How well you are able to actually communicate in the conversation, how well you're able to talk to people. And of course, for those people who are in schooling, academic language. Academic language becomes an important concept when it comes to language proficiency. We have to remember, however, that academic language is not a neutral variety. Academic language is not just a variety that somebody decided, okay, we're going to use this neutral variety to allow people succeed in school, and they have to master that variety so that they can succeed in school, because this variety seems to be neutral and natural way that people communicate, far away from being the truth, right? We all understand that. We all understand that that specific variety that people speak, specific way that people speak language, was chosen to be the academic standard or the standard for success in the field of academia or in schools. So what is important also here is that people's perceptions of who you are may actually influence how well they think you speak language. In other words, we know from research that people's perceptions of race would actually influence their judgment of learner language. We can have two students whose language proficiency is of similar level, of the same level, but these students being of different races and them being judged differently based on the same level of proficiency, but that their judgments are clouded and influenced by people's view of what a specific race should speak like, how a person looks, speaks like when it comes to second language. It's specifically and very important for second language learners. Of course, that's an important consideration when we think about psycholinguistic dimensions, specifically academic language. Beyond that, we have to consider that when you learn a second language, guess what? You know another language, right? So you come into second language learning with a different language that you already have as part of your repertoire. And so this idea that first language influences the second language is something that is very important, and we have to consider as language teachers, as well as this idea of metalinguistic awareness. Metalinguistic awareness being the ability to think about all of these things and understand them, right? To think about them metacognitively. So thinking about, I am able to understand that this is academic language and this is everyday language. I am able to understand that this is the way that grammar works, and this is the way that vocabulary works, and this is the way that we add suffixes or prefixes or whatnot to form new vocabulary, etc. So what does all of that mean for us as language teachers? Dr. Crawford, can we move on to the next slide, please? So we can go up just one more before that. Yeah, so here we have to think about, so what does it mean for us as teachers? So we have to really, we have a lot of tools available out there to assess linguistic proficiencies and repertoires. Those are, different tests that exist out there. Some of you maybe have participated in various test taking, be it TOEFL test or some other test of language ability, where they give you a score, and based on that score, you are accepted or not accepted into a specific program or something like that. There are many of those that are out there. As teachers, we also have to understand that we can and should also evaluate our own lessons based on proficiency focus to see where it is that what we are and what we are not doing in our language classes. And also thinking about translanguaging practices. In our book, we go into a discussion of translanguaging practices, but I don't have a lot of time to go into this today. But the idea here is that we do not consider first language as being something that is bad. Okay, we actually think of it as something that is good for second language learning. We think of it as something that is useful for second language learning. In addition to that, we also think that it's useful. First languages matter. because people matter and because them speaking that language matters. Their identity as a L1 speaker matters. And so their identity of who they are is not going to be English speaker here, Chinese speaker here, right? It's not like that. We can't just like turn on one part of the brain and turn off the other one. These abilities are intertwined. They form one unified system for learners. And therefore, we as teachers are to treat that as such. And translanguaging practices allow us to navigate between L1 and L2 within the same classroom in a way that helps our learners master L2 while at the same time develop L1 in the cases of children, for example, right? So that they grow up being individuals who are bilingual, who are able to use both of their languages successfully, which unfortunately is not always the case in terms of in situations of heritage language learners who are known to lose their heritage language when they start learning a second language. We don't want that to happen because we value that and we value our learners for who they are. And there are a couple of examples. Dr. Crawford, can we now move on to the next one? So this is one of the ways that we can think about. It's just an excerpt from one of the tools that we provide in the book for how we can evaluate our learners' repertoires of language that they have. They can fill out questionnaires where they can think about how, for example, they use different languages, which languages that they use and how they use different languages. And not only them, but also thinking about their family members. What do they do in English or any other languages? It continues to go into other languages as well and other abilities to use it in various settings. And the next example here is a little organizer that teachers can use to think about their own lessons. Which aspects of proficiency are they attending to? For example, discrete language skills or discrete language features and language forms, linguistic context of language features, sociocultural context, critical language awareness, general language awareness, and that comes to the this idea of metalinguistic awareness that I talked about earlier. So all of these tools, of course, are explained further in the book, but the idea here is to think about that language proficiency is not limited to discrete language skills. Teaching grammar is not enough. Teaching pronunciation in its own right is not enough. We need to do it well. We need to do it, and to do it well, it needs to be done in context, and it needs to be done with attention being paid to all of these aspects that you see here on this slide. All right, now I shift to Dr. Crawford. Dr. Crawford, you have the floor. Yeah.
Excellent. And I noticed a question that we'll come back to. One of our participants asked about why a first language benefits the second language. And Dr. Moore was explaining when she talks about this unified system or this common underlying proficiency that strengthening one language actually can help you build and strengthen an additional language. You can kind of increase your language proficiency for two for the price of one. And we can talk about that a bit more during the question and answer period if folks are interested. Excellent. So I want to talk a little bit, I want to turn now to talk about ideologies, programs, language programs, and policies. So when we discuss ideologies, we are going to be focusing on something called ideological clarity. When we speak to ideological clarity, what we are referencing is we are trying to foster this equity-oriented professionalism in teaching. And in order to do that, in order to have teachers not just follow a script or use a one-size-fits-every learner approach or one way of teaching every learner in every context, since we know that culture and society and identity and background knowledge and various language proficiencies, those all matter. We want to aid teachers and students to achieve equity by reflecting on their beliefs about how languages are learned, how languages are best taught, and what are the best programs, didactic materials, and teaching practices. In order to do that, it is important for us as language educators to analyze the ideological. And when I say ideological, I'm simply referring here to the sets of beliefs, ways of thinking, doing, and believing about language learning and language teaching. So it's important for us as English language teachers to analyze the ideological underpinnings of programs through how and which teaching materials, textbooks, etc., are used in our specific English language teaching programs. One way to do that is to collect and review documents, including things like textbooks and classroom language policies. The language policies that we have in our classrooms, such as which languages are students allowed to speak and when. One thing that we can work to do is to expand and adapt our language textbooks. We can also support students' dialogue and analysis, dialogue or communication in the classroom, and their own analyses of how languages are supported or not supported outside of the classroom and in our schools, and then jointly construct classroom language rules and policies together with our students. So let us begin again, coming back to California. I want to turn by casting our minds back to a historical event here in Los Angeles, actually just blocks away from where I'm speaking to you now, where they're called the Chicano student walkouts or blowouts of 1968. This was a pivotal moment that challenged and reshaped local educational policies towards language learners here in the state of California and in the United States writ large. It was a call for the recognition of Mexican and Mexican American contributions and a demand for bilingual and bicultural education that recognized context and experiences of the learners. This event involved students walking out of their classrooms and making a list of demands to the Los Angeles School Board and local teachers and administrators. The event reminds us that our teaching is never detached from socio-political currents that are swirling around us. So it's not just the culture and cultural differences, but also social and political movements and moments that we find ourselves in. That's also shapes the context in which we're teaching language. As we navigate through English language teaching, we define ideology as the framework of beliefs and values informing language policies and programs. You can think of ideology as sort of the invisible hand that guides the rules which govern our classrooms and the experiences of our learners, who can either be supported and celebrated or punished and put down. So we want to develop the kind of language ideologies that support this rich tapestry of linguistic and cultural knowledge that our students bring to the English language learning classroom. In this realm of classroom inquiry and thinking more about how do we reflect on how our own language ideologies shape our own policies, practices, and use of didactic materials, we can again become detectives in our own right and investigate and better understand how these ideologies are at play. We encourage critical classroom ethnography using tools such as, using tools such as what I mentioned with the Culturally Responsive Instructional Observation Protocol, CRIOP, C-R-I-O-P, to foster an environment of equity and inclusion. Moving towards our approaches to language teaching, we can advocate for leveraging our students' rich linguistic capital. This should involve adopting practices that support not only language development, but also the affirmation of students' cultural identities, as Dr. Moore explained. And it's also about nurturing our students' multiple language skills and creating classroom cultures that celebrate diversity. One way we can do this is to think about the standards, the language proficiency standards that we are teaching to. Consider the textbooks that we have been asked to use or that we currently are using in our classroom, or chapters or didactic materials. Reflect on some of the existing activities and assessments that we administer and enact in our classrooms, and some of the existing language learning goals or objectives. And we can augment that or add to that and build to that entry points to question our own beliefs as educators around how we think about language learning and the value of our students' multiple languages. And we can also encourage our students to think about their own beliefs about the role of the languages they are learning and their home languages. We can also connect to social justice standards, which we explain at great depth in our book. And we can think about adapting and expanding some of our learning objectives to include some of those standards. These social justice standards can include things like critical thinking about differences in the local community or among the target language speakers, our own identities and identities of those who speak target languages. We can also think about the ways in which we can use our languages to create more fair and equitable communities and interactions with others inside and outside of the classroom. We can adapt our activities and assessments to account for some of our cultural differences and various identities, and we can bring in additional materials and resources that are authentic, encourage communication and navigation of cultural differences, as well as encouraging our students to think critically about the target language speaking community and their own languages and language communities. In addition, we can create additional language policies or rules around how language is used. Here is one example, the CARE strategy that talks about community, asset, respect, and education connected to the ways in which we encourage our students to use language in the classroom. If anyone's interested, we can talk about this further. I want to go on. The point here with having an intentional language policy in the classroom is really in order to help our students to reflect on and most effectively use language in the language classroom to maximize their learning based on research and theory-driven practices. Finally, to conclude our talk, I want to talk about some of these theory-driven and method-driven pedagogies in TESOL. In the Matt TESOL program, as well as in the research and practices that Dr. Moore, Dr. Philback, and myself engage in this work, we are constantly working to connect research and theory to maximize and make our practice as effective and inclusive as possible. One way to do this is that teachers should really reject this always one right way to do things, or this idea that there's a neutral way to teach English, sort of a scripted or one size fits all approach. And really, we should leverage the current theories and research and methods to draw from, as if we had a giant toolbox, to draw from the multiple tools to be able to individualize and maximize the effectiveness of our instruction given an individual learner, our various individual learners' learning goals and their multiple contexts and language repertoires. In order to do that, we encourage teachers to write reflective memos and engage in reflection to analyze classroom data. What are practices that are effective for learners, and what are practices that are not supporting learners meeting their English language learning goals? In doing that, we want to consider our language learners' knowledge and context, both in how we shape the curriculum and our specific instructional practices, and ensure that we're not perpetuating or continuing inequities in the classroom and not privileging certain students over others, particularly not perpetuating well-resourced dominant learners and marginalizing our minoritized learners. We can do this through diversity, equity, and inclusion pedagogies. DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, is central to the USC Rossier Schools of Education's mission to effective and inclusive education policies, practice, and research. So I want to speak just for a moment before we close our speech or close our talk about critical, culturally relevant, and post-method pedagogies. And all of these methods share, or all of these approaches share the value that teachers should aim to meet the learning needs of the students in their context. There's never only one right answer. There's usually multiple right answers that are the best way you can meet the learner's needs. So let me give you an example. I want us to turn towards, or to begin with one final historical example, which is the adult literacy campaign led by Paulo Freire in Brazil in 1963. Picture this: Freire, a language educator, amidst a climate of 40% adult illiteracy, meaning lack of literacy, pioneers a revolutionary 40-hour program. He does not impose child-centric materials, which are sort of the best materials of the age. He doesn't impose those upon adult learners. He doesn't disrespect them by using infantilizing techniques, which have been the dominant techniques to teach literacy. Instead, he empowers his adult language learners with words sprung from the soil of their experiences. Words like brick, or in Portuguese, it's tijolo, for construction workers. Freire's method was not simply about reading words on a page. It was really about reading the world, reading the context in the text, using language as a way to discuss one's experiences, identities, hopes, dreams, concerns. Through this lens, students were invited to decode not just the language, but the very structures of their society, engaging in conversations and dialogues that intertwined literacy with critical thinking and action outside of the classroom. In this context, you can see this adult learner holding his daughter after a long day of work and breaking down various phonemes to identify and decode a word and be able to create new words related to his everyday experience. Why would I begin the journey in Brazil? Because Freire's legacy is a testament and an example of the transformative power of education that values learners' sociocultural backdrop, that values starting with learners' needs and knowledge rather than assuming that we know what is the best strategy or the best practice. These are principles as modern, innovative, research-based educators we must embody and adapt in our global classrooms. Now, let us define a few of the key final concepts. In our book, we go into great depth around language learning theories and teaching methods, and argue that this is the bedrock upon which we construct our pedagogical practices. From behaviorism to sociocultural theory, each approach offers a unique perspective on how we acquire language. Yet in isolation, they offer a very limited view. It is the synthesis, and this connects back to, we bring it back full circle to how Dr. Moore started. We are offering an additional view of social and cultural aspects of language acquisition and language instructional methodologies, not because they are the only orientation, but because they contribute an additional orientation. And it is the synthesis of these theories, melding them into these, and combining them with these social and cultural and equitable orientations that breathes life into an inclusive and effective TESOL practice. Our classroom inquiry methods should be dynamic as the theories that we discuss. We should practice reflective memos, data analysis, and the creation of language policy statements, not just as mere academic exercises, but these are really tools to excavate our own implicit biases, examine our beliefs and stances, and realign our teaching practices with current research, theories, and the goal to be as effective and inclusive English language teachers as possible. here's an example of some of the prompts that we might reflect in before, during, and after our language teaching. In many cases, we'll ask our students in the Matt Teasel program to reflect on the lessons they teach and share those reflections, connecting again theory to practice. Here's a few examples of some of the pedagogical orientations aligned with this research that I mentioned: critical pedagogies, culturally relevant or sustaining pedagogies, as well as post-method pedagogies. For language teaching approaches, let us not just teach English, but foster critical reading, writing, communication, and enable our learners to dissect and reconstruct narratives within texts, and thereby becoming agents of change in their own narratives. Ideas like reading the world in the word, or using English with others to communicate, or exploring language use in context, whether that's home, community, or the workplace. These are tangible pathways for our students to engage communicatively and critically with language in social, cultural, and political contexts. In conclusion, as we weave together these threads of theory and practice, it is important to remember that the ultimate goal is to support our learners to navigate with confidence and critical acumen the linguistic landscapes of their lives. Let this sort of unite our efforts as we work together and we learn together in our teaching practice and in our research to champion a pedagogy that is as diverse and as inclusive as the voices of our students and all those who we're sharing the space with together during this webinar. We are guided by this principle of effectiveness and equity, and we want to stand as not only English language teachers together, but also as citizens in a global community, and work to envision the ways in which we can most joyfully, effectively, and justly share language learning strategies and practices together to enact those meaningful versions of ourselves in English and other target languages. Thank you. And with that, I want to turn it back over to Dr. Moore.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful. So I wanted to kind of bring our attention back to who we are as people. People are social beings. We don't do very well when we're alone. We like to be in the company of loved ones and friends and families, and our students come to our classrooms as social beings. And therefore, those aspects of their lives, social aspects that are important to them, should be important to us. We not only accept students who they are in welcoming them in our classrooms, but we also have this idea of helping them achieve what they want to achieve. In other words, thinking about language as an instrument of change, and also an instrument of connection. And it is also an instrument of justice, for justice. And so thinking about our learners as social beings into our classrooms and transforming their lives through language teaching is really what the TESOL profession is about. By transforming their lives, we help them transform environment around them. We help them to become active citizens. We help them to become advocates of change themselves. So thank you so much for listening to us for this whole hour and dedicating an hour of your life to this important, as we believe, important topic. And I think that's it. And we are happy to answer any of the questions that you may have.
Awesome. Great. I'll just jump in. Thank you so much, Dr. Crawford and Dr. Moore. Really inspiring. And I think it's evidenced by the questions that have been coming in. And we have, let's see, April, am I right? Maybe about 15 minutes or 20 minutes for some questions. Perfect. So you all may be able to see some there in the chat. I'll just throw some out there, but if you want to grab some, one of them was coming from our live streaming audience. I think it's a great way to start building on what you just said, but what kind of efforts should society or individuals make to create a fair language education environment? That's a really big question, but it kind of segues very nicely from what you just ended with. And so I wonder if one of you has a thought.
Sorry, I was talking and I was muted. I think that question brings me back to Lau versus Nichols. What kind of responsibility did San Francisco School District have to the students of Chinese ancestry? Well, the Supreme Court decided that they had the responsibility of providing them with language that an ability to actually be taught, right? So being able to provide them with English instruction so that these learners, that students can learn in a way that is meaningful to them, as opposed to not being there. So what kind of responsibility do we have? We have a huge responsibility as a community, I believe, in allowing equitable learning opportunities for all students who come into our classrooms. And what does that mean? I think that today, when we talked about all of the aspects, social aspects that we discussed, they all apply and they all contribute towards creating those equitable opportunities for learning. Dr. Croft, I don't know if you have anything. That's what I'm thinking.
Great. So another question. So I have a doctoral student right now that's going to be looking at the issue of accent-based bias. And there's a question here that's sort of connected to that. Accent can be part of our own identity. So if students have strong accents, what way to help them be understood, and how do you approach that from a Social Foundation's perspective?
I'll take the first part and then share with both Dr. Moore and Dr. Philbeck. I know you work on this as well. The first thing that as TESOL professionals that we have a responsibility to do is to fight against any of the discrimination that any of our students might experience as non-native English speaking teachers. In fact, there's often a perception that native English speaking teachers are more highly sought after. And in fact, the opposite in terms of some of the research that we have shows that when an English teacher shares background linguistic knowledge with the learner, they in fact are much better at building the students' language awareness, their meta-linguistic language awareness. They're much better at being able to connect to the students, serve as mentors in that language learning process, connect and bridge cultural and social differences and similarities between target language speaking communities. So on many accounts, we know that based on research, non-native English speakers who share language with their learners can oftentimes be much more effective language teachers than native English speaking teachers who may not be aware of or know about some of the cultural, social, and linguistic practices and repertoires of their students. Moreover, oftentimes our non-native English speaking teachers or our teachers who are polyglots, multilinguals, speak 2, 3 languages, have a great deal more language awareness of the language forms than our monolingual English speaking teachers. It's not to say that it is that disqualifies you from being an English teacher if you are a monolingual English speaker. It is to say that the process of language learning provides you with a great deal of insight to be a more effective language teacher. And this is due, again, to many of the meta linguistic and metacognitive processes, the thinking about one's language learning process and thinking about languages and language differences, as well as some of the social and cultural features. Dr. Moore, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I think that, thank you, that this was very nicely said. I think that when we think about accents, we have to remember that everybody has an accent. Everybody. It's just a matter of the type of accent that you have, right? So then the next question is, what makes one accent better than the other accent? Somebody decided this is a good accent, this is not such a good accent, right? Big questions. So then coming back to this idea of us being social beings, people, us being people, we're social beings. What is the most important part about language? Is being able to communicate and understand each other. So when it comes to accent, the most important part is that we are able to communicate and understand each other. Whose responsibility is it a native speaker's responsibility, or is it a non-native speaker's to make a responsibility to make themselves understood? Where that responsibility falls, then that's the next question, right? Who is to assure of that? But this idea that the accent in itself is a bad thing, it's not, because everybody has you have a Midwestern accent, you have a New Yorker accent, you have a Russian accent, you have an Italian accent, the list goes on. Everybody has an accent. Most importantly is that we understand each other. And so that's where we as teachers need to come in and make sure that we help our learners be understood and help our learners understand, right? Because accent is not just about production. Accent is also about perception. It's how we hear and what we hear. And so that both of these processes work hand in hand, and therefore it is a language teacher's responsibility to work on both, and also work on the idea of not teaching our students that their accent is somehow deficient or bad just because it is not a New Yorker accent, or it's not an Australian accent, or it is not any other accent that you can think of.
And just to add one thing to that really quickly, Dr. Moore, sorry, I got excited, is we want in having that orientation, we want to encourage students to communicate.
Yes.
That's the main point. Your language proficiency will improve the more you use the language. You will get better at being understood and communicating the more you practice communicating and the more you use the language. And if we allow ourselves to be shamed or think that unless we precisely reproduce a particular accent, which is one of hundreds of thousands or many different valuable valid accents, then we will miss out on opportunities to improve our language and improve our ability to be understood and communicate. Back to you, Dr. Philback or Dr. Moore.
No, this is great. So let's move to economics. There are two questions related to economics. Tim in the Q&A pod talks about reading that economics also has some influence on language teaching. How sort of has this happened? And this connects to a question from the live stream platform. Is the economic basis also a main factor that affects educational inequity? So I think both these questions kind of get to this. How do we deal with the reality of the economic influence for our learners and their experiences? And then how can we increase access and mitigate that, especially for our maybe poorer students or those that maybe are in remote areas?
I'd want to start this off and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Moore, if that's okay. This brings me back to that final historical example that I gave of Paulo Freire working in northeastern Brazil, one of the poorest regions in the Americas at the time, one of the poorest regions in Brazil in the time. There was very, very few resources that they had, yet they had one of the most effective adult English language teaching methods that some of the most well-resourced contexts now copy. And why was that? It was because where Paulo Freire and other adult educators working with him started was with the background knowledge, resources, and everyday experiences of the learners. So rather than imposing from outside what they thought should be, what the students should know, or using as a measure, as a yardstick, some children's language development trajectory, or content that was only interesting to people in a place that was nothing like where these adults were living. They started with key words and concepts that were meaningful and useful to the work, to the experiences, to the challenges and the opportunities for those language learners. They came up with something called sort of their key codes or key terms, and started building on this, identifying what those students' knowledge was and building on that knowledge, using the resources that they had. And I think that we can see this with educators across the world. Some of our most innovative or most effective educators are those that start from a place of recognizing strength rather than immediately dismissing these contexts as lacking, as sort of just defining them on what they lack, or we call that a deficit orientation. That is not to downplay the significant challenges that lower socioeconomic status communities, rural communities, folks who have not had access to high quality schooling opportunities, there are tremendous roadblocks that those students face. However, we have seen tremendous gains in language learning when we use the resources and the knowledge that the students have. There's been some excellent gains in how we can effectively use technology, from cell phones to, in Paulo Freire's case, there's stories about using sticks in dirt and having getting the few resources they had to have learners and family members draw photos to codify various words and connect those to the stories and literacy goals that had been set, the language learning goals that had been set. My point is that if we step away from this idea that we have to teach language always the same way, with always the same materials, we oftentimes can find more effective ways to do that. I could go on about this for quite some time, but I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Moore and Dr. Philback, who I'm sure have quite a few additional ideas.
Well, you said it very nicely, Dr. Crawford. Thank you. So just the idea that, one of the things that we discuss in the book is the idea of funds of knowledge that students bring into the classroom. The idea that, that we don't want to go with the deficit perspective and see our learners from the deficit perspective, but rather acknowledge the fact that all learners have funds of knowledge that they bring into the classroom. Leveraging community members, family members is another way of doing that. And like Dr. Crawford said, that's not to diminish the tremendous help that time, tutors, and travel can do for those students who can't afford it, right? And how much it does do it for them. At the same time, what does time give us? It gives us individualized attention. Would the tutors, why are tutors successful? Because they do see their learners, and they do get to know them, and they do have that individualized attention starting from their knowledge, their funds of knowledge, their community wealth that they all bring into the classroom. That is there, and to deny it would be a big mistake. And so the idea would be to flip the script and really think about what is it that my students are bringing with them, as opposed to my students are poor, what do I do with that?
And just to add to that, you made me think of one other, well, there's so many things, but you made me think of one thing that I wanted to add. One of our colleagues, mentors and giants in the field, but also emeritus professor in our program, Dr. Stephen Krashen, talks about the importance of stories. And language and stories are all around us. I worked on a very short piece with Dr. Krashen about the importance of grandparents and family members telling stories to young children during the pandemic, and the role that that played in language acquisition, both supporting target language acquisition and maintaining heritage language proficiency skills. The point is, one of the beautiful things about being a language teacher is language is all around us. And as Dr. Krashen does, taking from Chomsky and others who are looking at first language acquisition, whether one is wealthy or poor, or seen as brilliant or not as brilliant, you still acquire your primary language or languages. And I think we can learn a lot from that and tell stories and make language accessible, guide learners through interpreting authentic resources that they find around them, design oral interpersonal communication tasks, etc., that tap into our learners' interests and knowledge. Dr. Philback.
This is great. I'm sensitive to the time. I want to turn it back over to April, but I also just want to thank both of you. You've brought it back to the core understanding that we need, and that is we're humans, we're social beings, and let's figure out how to use the language classroom to better care for each other and care for our students. And great work. Thank you so much. April, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Philback. And here I just add one more last questions. It relates to the Q&A we just mentioned earlier about the professional qualification. And as our audience asked about USC offer TESOL program, while some other university offer TEFL master's program. Are they all widely recognized in the US for teaching? And do you think any difference when the employers look for this degree to fit in a different teaching position?
That I can quickly answer that. I think that's a great question. One of the problems in our field is there are so many acronyms. So there's TESOL, there's TEFL, there's TESOL, there's ELD, ESL. It really gets the list gets to be quite long. The core difference between TESOL and TEFL is that one, TEFL focuses on English as a foreign language. So it's the idea of teaching English in a context where the rest of the English medium is something other than English. TESOL, little broader, it's teaching English to speakers of other languages, whether they be in a foreign context or whether you're in a domestic context, teaching English language learners in an English medium context. So that's just really a little, I'd say, relatively slight distinction, but maybe not insignificant for many of you. And it might be something you'd want to consider as you look at different programs like that.
Thank you, Dr. Philback. And also thank you, Dr. Moore and Dr. Crawford, for giving us a wonderful event that until now we have, it's above 18,000 viewers coming in all our platforms in total, and with different social background to learn English. So for the end, to close up this event, and we would like to invite our speakers to give some words or suggestions to our audience.
I'll defer to Drs. Crawford and Dr. Moore for a final word.
I'm humbled and honored to continue to learn. I see many of my current and past students in the webinar space and in the chat. I think the best we can do is to continue to learn and grow together in order to enact the most effective and equitable teaching practices, again, that bridge the most recent theories and research to the ways in which we create right curriculum and teach English language. So it's an honor, it's a journey, it's a process that we are continuing to research and reflect on, and I look forward to engaging this process together in the future.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, and thank you for being here and for your interest in this profession. I really think that this profession is very important. And I hope that you decide to continue with it. I hope that you decide to continue or continue with your plans to become a teacher, or if you're a teacher already, continue with doing a good job in your classroom and really treating your students with the dignity and respect that they deserve, and creating those opportunities for all learners that you may meet in your classrooms. And if you would like to reach out to us, please do. And we'll be happy to engage in further conversations if you have any questions for us. So, and thank you for spending your time here tonight, and for being here, for your interest. Really humbled by that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. And again, thank you, Dr. Crawford and Dr. Philback.